Hello, my friends. I am very happy you are here today. Take a moment to relax and let this story carry you back more than 2,000 years into the past. Imagine standing on a dusty road as thousands of soldiers march toward a horizon that never seems to end. Behind them lies the world they know. Ahead lies a land no one in their army has ever seen. Leading them is a young king. He is not yet 30 years old, yet he has already conquered nations, defeated powerful armies, and built an empire larger than anyone thought possible. But victory is not enough for him. Each time he reaches a new frontier, he wonders what lies beyond it. His name was Alexander the Great, and this is his story. The prince who was raised to dream beyond borders. Alexander entered the world in 356 BC in the Kingdom of Macedonia, a growing power located north of the Greek city-states. His birth took place during a period of political competition, military conflict, and constant change. Kingdoms rose and fell, alliances shifted, and ambitious rulers searched for ways to expand their influence. It was a world where strength mattered, leadership was tested continuously, and the future often belonged to those willing to pursue it boldly. His father, King Philip II, had transformed Macedonia from a relatively modest kingdom into a formidable force. Through military reforms, strategic planning, and political skill, Philip strengthened his army and expanded his influence across the region. Many people admired him as a leader who possessed both intelligence and determination. Watching his father's achievements gave young Alexander an early understanding of what strong leadership could accomplish. His mother, Olympias, influenced him in a very different way. She was passionate, ambitious, and deeply interested in stories of heroes and destiny. She often encouraged Alexander to think of himself as someone meant for extraordinary things. Whether these beliefs shaped his future directly or simply strengthened his confidence, they became part of the environment in which he grew up. As a child, Alexander was surrounded by conversations about politics, military campaigns, diplomacy, and leadership. Unlike most children, he spent his early years observing people who carried immense responsibilities. He listened carefully, asked questions, and developed an interest in the larger world beyond his immediate surroundings. Yet what captured his imagination most were stories. Ancient Greece possessed a rich tradition of epic tales that had been passed down for generations. Stories of heroes, explorers, warriors, and adventurers filled the imagination of young listeners. Among all these figures, none fascinated Alexander more than Achilles, the legendary warrior from Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. He admired Achilles not simply because he was brave in battle. He admired him because he represented courage, ambition, and the pursuit of greatness. The story suggested that a person could leave a lasting mark on history through determination and extraordinary effort. These ideas resonated deeply with Alexander and remained with him throughout his life. While many royal children focused primarily on hunting, sports, and entertainment, Alexander's education followed a more demanding path. His parents understood that ruling a kingdom required more than physical strength. A future king needed knowledge, judgment, and the ability to understand complex problems. To provide this education, they chose one of the most respected thinkers of the ancient world, Aristotle. Aristotle was already famous for his intellect and his contributions to philosophy, science, and learning. Under his guidance, Alexander received an education unlike that of most young nobles. Lessons extended far beyond military training. He studied geography, ethics, literature, medicine, politics, natural science, and philosophy. Through these subjects, Alexander encountered ideas that expanded his understanding of the world. He learned about distant regions, unfamiliar peoples, and cultures far beyond Macedonia. Ancient maps, although incomplete by modern standards, revealed lands stretching far into the unknown. Every lesson seemed to suggest that the world was much larger and more complex than most people realized. These studies awakened something powerful within him. He became fascinated by exploration and discovery. While others viewed distant territories as remote and unimportant, Alexander imagined what they might contain. He wondered about the people who lived there, the landscapes that existed beyond familiar borders, and the opportunities waiting in places no Macedonian had ever seen. As he grew older, his confidence became increasingly noticeable. Friends, Teachers and military leaders observed that Alexander possessed an unusual belief in his own abilities. He approached challenges with determination and rarely accepted the idea that something could not be accomplished. This confidence was demonstrated during an event that became famous throughout Macedonia. A powerful horse named Bucephalus had been brought before the royal court. The animal was strong, energetic, and difficult to control. Experienced riders failed to manage it, and many people believed the horse was simply impossible to tame. Alexander watched carefully. Rather than focusing on the horse's behavior alone, he observed what was causing its fear. He realized that the animal became frightened whenever it saw its own shadow. Turning the horse toward the sun so the shadow disappeared, Alexander gradually calmed it and successfully mounted it. The achievement impressed everyone who witnessed it. The story became more than a tale about a horse. It revealed something important about Alexander's character. He looked beyond the surface of problems. He searched for causes, patterns, and solutions. While others saw an obstacle, he searched for a way forward. By the time he reached his teenage years, Alexander had already developed many of the qualities that would later define his life. He possessed intelligence, ambition, confidence, curiosity, and an intense desire to achieve something meaningful. Most importantly, he refused to think small. When he looked at maps, he did not focus on the borders that separated kingdoms. He focused on the vast spaces beyond them. Every distant horizon seemed to invite exploration. Every unknown region sparked his imagination. Long before he became one of history's most famous rulers, the dream that would shape his future had already begun growing within him. He wanted to see more, learn more, and travel farther than anyone before him. The world appeared immense, and Alexander intended to discover just how far it extended. A young king faces an uncertain future. For many years, Alexander had prepared for leadership. He had studied under great teachers, learned from experienced military commanders, and watched his father govern one of the strongest kingdoms in the region. Yet no amount of preparation could fully prepare a young man for the moment when responsibility suddenly became reality. In 336 BC, everything changed. King Philip II was assassinated during a public celebration. The shocking event sent waves of uncertainty throughout Macedonia. The kingdom had lost the leader who had transformed it into a major power, and questions immediately arose about what would happen next. Alexander was only 20 years old. Although he had already shown intelligence and courage, many people believed he lacked the experience necessary to rule. Some nobles wondered whether he could maintain control of the kingdom. Foreign rulers viewed the situation as an opportunity. Enemies who had once feared Philip began imagining a future in which Macedonia would weaken and eventually collapse. The atmosphere was filled with tension. Whenever a powerful ruler dies, uncertainty often follows. People begin choosing sides. Ambitious individuals seek advantage. Old rivalries return. Alexander inherited not only a throne but also a collection of problems that threatened the stability of everything his father had built. Several regions that had been brought under Macedonian influence decided this was the perfect moment to challenge the new king. Leaders who had previously obeyed Philip believed a young ruler might be easier to resist. Rebellions began to emerge, and rumors spread rapidly across the ancient world. Some observers expected Alexander to spend months trying to secure his position. He acted immediately. He understood that hesitation could be dangerous. If uncertainty continued for too long, more regions might rebel, and Macedonia's enemies could become bolder. Rather than waiting for problems to grow larger, Alexander moved quickly to confront them. Traveling across his kingdom, he met challenges directly. He visited areas where loyalty seemed uncertain and demonstrated that the government remained strong despite Philip's death. His energy surprised both supporters and opponents. People who expected indecision instead encountered a ruler who seemed completely committed to protecting his kingdom. These actions carried an important message. Alexander wanted everyone to understand that while the king had changed, Macedonia's strength had not disappeared. His confidence became especially important when news arrived from neighboring regions. Several Greek city-states saw an opportunity to regain independence from Macedonian influence. They believed the young king might struggle to respond effectively. Alexander proved them wrong. Leading his forces with remarkable speed, he moved south and re-established control. His willingness to take decisive action convinced many potential opponents that challenging him would not be easy. Within a relatively short period, he had restored stability and secured his position as ruler. Yet these early successes represented only the beginning of a much larger story. Most kings would have spent years consolidating power and enjoying the privileges of leadership. Alexander's ambitions extended much farther. While others focused on protecting what they already possessed, he was thinking about what could still be achieved. The vision that motivated him had originated with his father. For years, King Philip II had planned a massive campaign against the Persian Empire. Persia was the greatest superpower of its age. Its territory stretched across enormous distances, connecting countless peoples, cities, and cultures. Its wealth was legendary. Its armies were vast. Many regarded it as unbeatable. To challenge such an empire required extraordinary confidence. Most rulers would have considered the idea unrealistic. The risks were enormous, and failure could destroy everything Macedonia had accomplished. Alexander viewed the situation differently. Where others saw danger, he saw possibility. The stories he had studied as a child, the lessons he had learned from Aristotle, and the experiences he had gained during his youth all combined to shape his thinking. He believed that great achievements required bold action. Remaining within familiar boundaries held little appeal. He wanted to test himself against the greatest challenge available. As he considered the future, he became increasingly convinced that Macedonia's destiny lay beyond its borders. Preparations soon began. Soldiers gathered. Supplies were organized. Military leaders developed plans for a campaign unlike anything the kingdom had attempted before. Thousands of men prepared to leave their homes and follow their young king into unfamiliar territory. No one could predict exactly what would happen. Success was uncertain. The journey would be dangerous. Powerful enemies stood in their path. Yet Alexander felt ready. The 20-year-old ruler, who had inherited a kingdom during a moment of crisis, was now preparing to launch one of history's most ambitious military expeditions. The challenges he faced after his father's death had tested his leadership. The decisions he made had strengthened his confidence. Soon he would leave Macedonia behind and begin a journey that would carry him farther than he had ever imagined. The world beyond the horizon was waiting, and Alexander intended to meet it head-on. The journey that became an empire. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood at the edge of a journey that would define his life and reshape the ancient world. Behind him lay Macedonia, the kingdom he had inherited. Ahead stood the Persian Empire, a vast realm stretching across enormous distances and governing millions of people. For generations, Persia had been regarded as the most powerful empire on earth. Its wealth was legendary, its armies were immense, and its influence extended across continents. Many observers believed that challenging such a giant was reckless. Alexander saw something different. He believed that success often belonged to those willing to attempt what others considered impossible. Gathering an army of loyal soldiers, experienced commanders, and trusted companions, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow body of water separating Europe from Asia. With that crossing, he left behind the familiar world of his youth and entered a new chapter filled with uncertainty, danger, and opportunity. The campaign began with a series of confrontations that tested both his leadership and military skill. Persian forces expected the young king to make mistakes. They assumed his ambition would exceed his ability. Instead, Alexander demonstrated a remarkable talent for strategy. He moved quickly, adapted to changing circumstances, and inspired extraordinary loyalty among his soldiers. Each victory increased his confidence and strengthened the belief that his goals were achievable. As news of his successes spread, many cities and regions found themselves facing an important decision. Some chose resistance. Others opened their gates and accepted his authority. Throughout Asia Minor, Alexander's influence expanded steadily. Territories that had once seemed distant now became part of his growing empire. One of the most important moments came when he faced King Darius III, the ruler of Persia. Darius commanded enormous resources and controlled one of history's greatest empires. On paper, the Persian king appeared to possess every advantage. Yet Alexander repeatedly demonstrated that leadership, discipline, and intelligent planning could sometimes outweigh larger numbers. Major victories at battles such as Issus and later Gaugamela transformed the balance of power. These encounters became turning points that weakened Persian control and elevated Alexander's reputation throughout the known world. Yet his journey was not defined entirely by warfare. As he traveled farther east, Alexander encountered societies very different from his own. He met people who spoke unfamiliar languages, practiced different religions, and followed customs he had never seen before. Ancient roads carried him through bustling cities, fertile valleys, mountain regions, and deserts stretching toward distant horizons. Many conquerors viewed foreign cultures as obstacles to overcome. Alexander often approached them with curiosity. He recognized that the lands he entered possessed their own histories, traditions, and achievements. Rather than attempting to erase every local custom, he frequently sought ways to build connections between different peoples. This approach helped him govern an empire that contained extraordinary diversity. In some regions, he adopted elements of local traditions. He welcomed talented individuals into positions of responsibility regardless of their background. His goal extended beyond military conquest. He wanted to create a realm where ideas, knowledge, and cultures could interact in ways that had previously been impossible. One of the most famous examples of this vision appeared in Egypt. When Alexander arrived there, many people welcomed him as a liberator. Egyptian society had experienced years of Persian rule, and his arrival marked the beginning of a new era. During his time in Egypt, he founded a city that would carry his name, Alexandria. The city occupied a strategic location along the Mediterranean coast and quickly became one of the most important urban centers of the ancient world. Merchants, scholars, travelers, and thinkers from many different backgrounds eventually gathered there. Over time, Alexandria became renowned for learning, trade, and intellectual exchange. The city reflected Alexander's broader vision. He was not simply building an empire of territory. He was creating connections between civilizations. Despite these achievements, satisfaction remained elusive. Each time Alexander reached a destination that others considered extraordinary, he began looking toward the next horizon. Each success seemed to fuel a new desire for exploration. Vast distances that would have appeared unimaginable to most people felt merely like stages along a larger journey. His companions noticed this restless energy. Many soldiers celebrated victories as opportunities to enjoy what they had already accomplished. Alexander viewed them as invitations to continue moving forward. The farther he traveled, the stronger his curiosity became. Ancient maps remained incomplete, and countless regions beyond his empire were still unknown to him. Questions filled his mind. What lay beyond the mountains, visible in the distance? What civilizations existed farther east? How large was the world beyond the territories already explored? These questions continued driving him onward. Years after leaving Macedonia, Alexander had conquered more territory than almost anyone before him. Yet he rarely spoke as though the journey were finished. The world still seemed larger than any map could fully capture. The campaign that began as an invasion of Persia gradually transformed into something much greater. It became an extraordinary expedition across continents, cultures, and civilizations. With every mile traveled, Alexander grew more convinced that the boundaries people accepted were often far smaller than reality itself. The young king who had crossed into Asia searching for victory was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming a ruler whose ambitions stretched toward horizons that seemed endless, a man determined to discover how far the world truly extended. Chasing the edge of the world, by the time Alexander's army had marched across Persia, Egypt, and vast regions of Asia, they had already achieved what many people considered impossible. Kingdoms had fallen before them. Great cities had become part of their expanding empire. The young king, who once ruled a relatively small kingdom in Macedonia, now governed territories stretching farther than most people of the ancient world could imagine. For many leaders, such accomplishments would have been more than enough. Alexander thought differently. The farther he traveled, the more curious he became. Every new land seemed to raise new questions. Every horizon suggested another waiting beyond it. Instead of feeling satisfied by what he had already achieved, he remained fascinated by what still remained unknown. Year after year, The army continued moving eastward. The journey exposed them to landscapes unlike anything they had encountered before. Sometimes they crossed fertile valleys where rivers nourished thriving communities. In other regions, they traveled through barren deserts where survival itself became a daily challenge. They climbed mountain passes covered in snow and descended into plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Each environment demanded adaptation. The soldiers encountered unfamiliar animals, strange plants, new languages, and customs that differed greatly from those of their homeland. Many of the places they visited had never seen Macedonian armies before. For Alexander, these differences made the journey even more exciting. He enjoyed learning about distant cultures and observing how people lived in regions far removed from Greece and Macedonia. Yet while curiosity motivated their king, the realities of the expedition weighed heavily upon his followers. Many soldiers had left home years earlier. Some had not seen their families in nearly a decade. Children they remembered as infants were growing into young adults. My parents were aging. Friends had disappeared from their lives. The longer the campaign continued, the stronger their desire became to return home. The hardships of the journey added to their exhaustion. Long marches under intense heat drained their strength. Difficult terrain slowed progress. Supplies sometimes became harder to obtain. Battles brought danger, injuries, and loss. Even successful victories carried a physical and emotional cost. Despite these challenges, loyalty to Alexander remained strong. His soldiers admired his courage because he often shared their hardships. He marched alongside them, faced many of the same dangers, and demonstrated a willingness to lead from the front. These qualities earned their respect. Still, admiration could not erase fatigue. As the army moved farther east, ancient maps became increasingly unreliable. The known world seemed to fade behind them. Information about the lands ahead often came from travelers' stories, local guides, and rumors that were difficult to verify. Some accounts described wealthy kingdoms filled with opportunity. Others spoke of powerful rulers commanding vast armies. Many stories mentioned lands extending beyond anything the Macedonians had previously explored. For Alexander, such stories acted like invitations. He wanted to see these places with his own eyes. He wanted to understand what existed beyond the boundaries that earlier generations had accepted. The possibility of discovering something new continued pulling him forward. This relentless journey brought the army into parts of India. The region presented challenges unlike any they had previously faced. The climate was unfamiliar. Seasonal rains transformed the landscape. Rivers were larger than many soldiers had ever seen. Dense vegetation covered areas where movement became difficult. The people they encountered also proved formidable opponents. Local rulers resisted fiercely. Some commanded powerful armies equipped with war elephants, animals that many Macedonian soldiers had never faced in battle. These enormous creatures created a dramatic and intimidating sight on the battlefield. The encounters tested both Alexander and his army. Although they continued achieving victories, each success demanded significant effort. The distance from Macedonia seemed greater than ever. Home felt unimaginably far away. As months passed, a growing number of soldiers began questioning how much farther they could continue. They had followed Alexander across continents. They had helped build one of history's largest empires. They had endured years of hardship in pursuit of his vision. Now they wanted something different. They wanted to see their families. They wanted to return to familiar places. They wanted rest after years of constant movement. Alexander, however, remained focused on the horizon. He believed there were still more lands to explore and more discoveries to make. The dream that had motivated him since childhood had never disappeared. He still wanted to know what lay beyond the next river, the next mountain range, and the next distant frontier. The first time in his career, he faced a challenge that military strategy could not solve. His opponents were not enemy kings or rival armies. His challenge was the exhaustion of his own men. The soldiers had reached their limit. No speech, no plan, and no victory could change that reality. Alexander listened to their concerns and recognized the depth of their fatigue. The realization was difficult for him. Few things disappointed him more than turning away from an unexplored horizon. Yet leadership sometimes requires accepting realities that cannot be ignored. After careful consideration, he made a decision. The army would return. For many soldiers, the announcement brought relief. For Alexander, it marked the end of a dream that remained unfinished. He had spent years chasing what seemed to be the edge of the world, only to discover that some limits are not defined by geography but by human endurance. The return journey would carry him back across the vast empire he had created. Yet the lessons of this moment remained important. The ruler who had crossed continents and defeated powerful empires learned that even the greatest ambition must occasionally yield to circumstance. The world still stretched beyond the horizon, but the men who had helped him reach this point could go no farther. It was a humbling realization for a king who had spent much of his life proving that the impossible could become possible. The legacy of a man who refused to accept limits. When Alexander finally began the long journey back toward the western regions of his empire, he was no longer simply the king of Macedonia. He had become the ruler of a realm larger than anything his people could have imagined when he first crossed into Asia years earlier. His empire stretched from Greece and Egypt in the west to distant territories near India in the east. Vast deserts, fertile valleys, towering mountains, and bustling cities all existed under his authority. The scale of what he had accomplished amazed the ancient world. Only a decade earlier, he had been a young ruler facing doubts about his ability to govern. Many people questioned whether he could preserve the kingdom inherited from his father. Instead, he transformed that kingdom into one of history's largest empires before reaching the age of 30. Yet territory alone does not explain why Alexander's story has survived for more than 2,000 years. Many conquerors gained land and later disappeared from memory. Alexander's influence endured because his journey created changes that extended far beyond military victories. As his armies traveled across continents, they connected regions that had previously interacted very little with one another. Merchants gained access to new trade routes. Scholars encountered unfamiliar ideas. Artists discovered different styles and traditions. Languages, customs, and knowledge began moving across borders in ways that had rarely occurred before. Imagine a merchant from Greece encountering products from distant Asia. Imagine scholars exchanging ideas that originated hundreds or even thousands of miles apart. Imagine cities where people from different backgrounds lived, worked, and learned together. These interactions became increasingly common because of the connections Alexander helped create. Throughout his empire, new cities emerged. Some already existed and expanded under his rule. Others were founded during his campaigns. Among them, Alexandria in Egypt became particularly important. Over time, it developed into one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning, attracting scholars, scientists, writers, and thinkers from many different cultures. Knowledge traveled through these cities. Ideas traveled through these cities. People traveled through these cities. The result was a period of cultural exchange that influenced generations long after Alexander himself was gone. Yet despite his extraordinary achievements, Alexander's life would be surprisingly short. In 323 BC, after years of constant travel, warfare, leadership, and administration, he became seriously ill while in Babylon. Historians continue debating the exact cause of his death. Some theories suggest disease, others propose different explanations. What remains certain is that the illness worsened rapidly. Soon afterward, Alexander died at the age of 32. The news stunned those who heard it. Many people struggled to believe that a man who had achieved so much in such a short period could be gone so suddenly. His soldiers mourned the leader they had followed across continents. His supporters worried about the future of the empire. His enemies saw uncertainty approaching. One enormous question immediately emerged. Who would succeed him? Alexander had built an empire stretching across vast distances, but he had not established a clear plan for long-term succession. As a result, powerful generals and leaders began competing for influence after his death. The empire fragmented into separate kingdoms. The political unity Alexander had created gradually disappeared. Different regions came under the control of different rulers. The empire itself did not survive in its original form, yet the collapse of the empire did not erase its influence. The cultural connections established during Alexander's lifetime continued shaping the ancient world for centuries. Trade routes remained active, cities continued growing, knowledge continued spreading between regions that had once been separated by enormous distances. This lasting impact is one reason historians remain fascinated by Alexander today. Some scholars emphasize his military brilliance. They study the battles he fought and the strategies he employed. Others focus on his political vision and his efforts to connect different peoples and cultures. Still others examine the personal qualities that drove him to pursue goals that most individuals would have considered impossible. Debates about his legacy continue because his life was complex. He was a conqueror, but he was also an explorer. He was a military commander, but he was also a student of knowledge and culture. He possessed tremendous ambition, yet he remained endlessly curious about the world around him. The most remarkable aspect of Alexander's story is the way he approached boundaries. Whenever he encountered a frontier, he wondered what existed beyond it. Whenever he reached a destination, he looked toward another horizon. The unknown did not frighten him, it attracted him. This mindset shaped every major chapter of his life. It motivated him as a young student learning about distant lands. It guided him as a king confronting powerful enemies. It inspired him as a traveler moving farther from home than most people of his era could imagine. Centuries have passed since Alexander walked the earth, yet his story continues to capture human imagination because it speaks to something timeless. People admire individuals who challenge accepted limits, pursue ambitious goals, and remain curious about what lies beyond the familiar. Alexander the Great is remembered not simply because he conquered territory. He is remembered because he refused to believe that the edge of the known world was the edge of possibility. His life became a reminder that human achievement often begins when someone decides to explore beyond the boundaries others accept. That spirit of exploration remains his greatest legacy, and it is why his story continues to inspire people around the world even today. Alexander's journey reminds us that curiosity and ambition have the power to reshape history. He began as a young prince in a small kingdom, and became one of the most famous figures the world has ever known. His story is not only about conquest, it is about vision, determination, and the desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. Thank you for listening, my friends. Until our next story, keep learning, keep exploring, and never stop being curious about the world around you.